So we're going to spend the bulk of the next 20 or 30 minutes talking about using telehealth to improve sepsis management, and hopefully everyone participating can bring back some lessons learned on how to leverage telehealth tools for sepsis care. We need to just sort of set the table a little bit and just talk about what is the context for all of this work. So again, UC Health is a moderate-sized healthcare system in Colorado. It has 12 hospitals and about 2,000 inpatient beds. And probably really the thing to take away is just the variety and heterogeneity of all of those hospitals. We have the University of Colorado Hospital, our quaternary care center, that does all of the fancy things that academic centers do. But then we have very, very small community sites with only 15 or 20 inpatient beds. And because of that, of course, there's plenty of practice variation on just how we do clinical care, and that certainly holds true for sepsis as well. So this is just another way to present that same information. This is our footprint of brick and mortar facilities at UC Health. And again, our mission is try and deliver care throughout Colorado, if not beyond, regionally up into Wyoming, Nebraska, et cetera. But you can see, again, while we're spread out over several hundred miles, we don't have close access or brick and mortar facilities everywhere in Colorado. And our solution to that is telemedicine. That's what helps us sort of expand our reach for our actual service area. And then culturally, who are we? I think that's important too. I think we've invested considerable capital and resources in developing a system telemedicine program, and we want to be in this space over here, in this innovation and early adopter space. And I think as we talk about our virtual sepsis program, that's going to be a good case example of that. So what does that look like for us? There's lots of ways that we can bucket telemedicine, and again, the four big buckets are live interactive video, which I'm sure many of us are doing now in this era of COVID, remote patient monitoring as well, mobile health. Those are just a few examples. But the way we like to even think about our telemedicine programs is basically built on three foundations here. So the first is device integration. And really what I mean by that is the ability to take bedside clinical information, specifically vital sign data, and be able to export that into our telemedicine command hub. Then we want to overlay, that's an enormous amount of data that is streaming through from 2,000 inpatient beds. So we need some help sort of interpreting that data. We can't just have tens or even hundreds of eyes looking at the data. That's not scalable. So we have to have this idea of prescriptive intelligence to help us queue that data and look for, again, sort of red flags where a patient might be deteriorating. And we use that with predictive algorithms. And then this last piece, which is, again, foundational to the sepsis program, is our telemedicine command hub itself. So this is a picture of our virtual health center. This is a hardened building like a hospital with backup generators and power, broadband capability that's quite fast. And we've sort of carved it up into 4 pods. This is sort of our provider pod that has 24/7 nursing, physician assistants, and physicians, again, on site 24/7 every day of the year. And back here, we have a number of technicians working on our centralized monitoring program. So we launched this in about 2016. Again, as I think I said, there's about 4,000 square feet of space, and we're sort of rapidly expanding as we sort of have successful proof of concepts. So here's just a picture again of our providers, in this case, delivering some care through our virtual urgent care, but get a sense of sort of the workstations and multiple monitors to be able to be and flip back and forth between care environments and all of those hospitals. So what are our guiding principles? So one, we're just sort of big enough to even consider using our own providers to deliver any type of telemedicine care. We wanted to be able to sort of take advantage of our brand and not have to use national companies or for-profit companies to deliver this actual care. And then this was critical too. We wanted to be able to embed all of these virtual health tools into our electronic health record wherever possible. Again, pre-COVID, when the incentives were just not not as powerful as they are today to use telemedicine. Anything that we could do to make the process simpler, we thought would actually drive adoption, and we still think that that's going to be important today. So again, what has been our strategy? That's a big center, and we want to intersect really at every part of the actual care continuum, right? And so whether or not that's using virtual triage for virtual emergency care, again, more convenient care in our virtual urgent care, consults. We've launched a remote monitoring program for in the patient's home for post-COVID discharge. And then we'll talk more again, specifically to sepsis, about just acute surveillance, where we're taking data and from both the bedside in terms of vital signs, as well as demographic characteristics to give someone basically a sepsis risk score and then be able to actually act on it. Here's just a list of all the services that are built into that building. Again, you can see our virtual sepsis response program is one of about 10 programs. Our physicians don't participate in all of them. Some of them are actually technician-based, but the scope is quite extensive. So that's a good sort of transition just to say, okay, well, what is this sort of case? Why actually even try and deliver sepsis care virtually? And we're going to talk about some of the technology in the process, but it's worth, again, talking about this idea that the technology is never the hardest part, and that the change management is always the trickiest part. And that was certainly held true with our experience with our virtual sepsis program. So again, this author may not be familiar to many of you, maybe in the international audience, but he's a famous change management guru, and sort of helps us sort of break down how we can approach this sort of practice transformation so that it's actually, I guess, sort of easier to digest for bedside clinicians and feels sort of less threatening. So through that lens, again, what is the urgency? And certainly what was the urgency for UC Health? Well, about a third of people who die in hospitals, and this is across the world, die of sepsis. That's an enormous problem. In terms of specific numbers for our health system, again, at our biggest hospital, we have about 2,500 cases at the University Hospital annually, and over 6,000 across UC Health. So this is going to be a big problem. And this is sort of the key piece of data, which is that our mortality was higher than we wanted it to be. It was higher than expected. So based on our case mix in terms of the intensity and how sick our patients were, they were unfortunately dying from sepsis at a 7% higher rate than we would actually expect. And that's translated here to 40 lives that we could save if we delivered optimal sepsis care. And though our quality improvement efforts had been focused on sepsis for a couple of years, we sort of stalled out in what we could, I guess, sort of juice from the lemon. We just didn't have any more juice to actually move the needle on sepsis mortality. And so that was the genesis of why we even considered delivering this care virtually. So now, I did want to sort of point this out as well, because it's hard not to talk about the elephant in the room, and then COVID basically as a lever for healthcare transformation. And I'm sure for many of you in your home institutions, you've had a similar experience, which is these are our home telehealth visits in the pre-COVID era for us in early March, right? Where over 700 clinics, we're maybe seeing 20 virtual visits a day. But again, as the incentives to actually deliver care virtually change, and frankly, it's the only option to deliver care in many instances, we went from delivering 20 visits a day virtually to over 4,000 over the span of 4 weeks. And that is, it's the learning curve there was enormous. But but what's transformational about this is that everyone has been involved and has been exposed to telemedicine in our past sort of 2 months, and that's going to have a decade-long ramification in a positive direction. So, and this is probably similar to what has happened with you all as well. This was our inpatient volume pre-COVID. You can see the bottom just drops out, and we've lost over 66% of our our outpatient volume. And this is our response and our ability to actually deliver care virtually. It's sort of important to point out that if we added these volumes together, we're not going to get back to our pre-COVID volume, and that sort of gap is where we need to be innovative in how we actually think about delivering care virtually to meet patients where they want to be, because I think in this stage, again, patients are still afraid to get care in brick and mortar facilities, and that's a fear that probably won't go permanently away. So here's another sort of specific reasons on again, why to actually even think about a virtual sepsis program. I mean, providers are just less mobile now due just to the constraints of putting on and taking off personal protective gear. And then that PPE itself is, of course, scarce. And so being able to do these virtual evaluations, that's actually going to preserve our limited stocks of PPE. But I mean, why does this work? This is sort of the foundational reason why this is work, and why our focus is just how can we actually deliver the right antibiotics in as fast of time as possible, and obviously not deliver antibiotics for those patients that do not need it. And this, of course, is our sort of survival curve, where if we can deliver our antibiotics, especially within 1 hour, we're going to have much better outcomes in terms of mortality. So again, how did we start all this? Well, we really did have to create a coalition, and this really needed to be driven from the top of our leadership. And luckily we had that. We had our chief information officers engaged, our chief medical officers engaged, and we all partnered with, again, our quality teams and our virtual care teams to actually build this program. And frankly, to sell it to thousands of our healthcare providers. So what did our process actually look like? So this was, again, before the virtual health center here. We did use a predictive algorithm called the early warning score, which again crunches vital sign data, demographic data from the charts. But the real sort of the downside of that actual model is that a nurse, to actually see that score, would have to be in the patient's chart. And so that introduced oftentimes a delay in care. If that nurse hadn't been in the patient's chart for several hours and they were scoring high for a sepsis risk, no one would actually see it. Let's say they do see it, then they're going to actually, we have a nurse protocol to actually order a complete blood count and a lactate. But again, in that old process, there was really nobody who really had eyes on to actually look when that lactate would return, which again is our sort of our canary in the coal mine for someone who's actually quite sick from sepsis. So again, this is our before process. This is how we redesigned our process to leverage our virtual health center. So the first is that we have actually a dedicated resource who's there to actually look at all times for those sepsis scores to actually pop up. So, and they don't actually have to be in the chart. So that generates an actual queue that a nurse can actually review. And so if I get a high sepsis score, if I'm a patient in a hospital, our virtual health center nurse would review that, do a chart review, make sure that it actually makes sense, and then do that same thing where we're drawing a CBC if appropriate, and a lactate to stratify between severe sepsis and again, what I guess would call simple sepsis. So, and then we're going to actually, as we say, be sort of the captain of the ship here, where we're actually tracking milestones in the delivery of sepsis care all the way through our paradigm, which is a 6-hour care arc, or what's called the SEP1 bundle. So here's an example of that queue. So this is part of our technology here. This is in practice environment data. So our unit here, we're actually watching patients in the burn ICU, and you can see we have red scores here. We have 4 actually predictive algorithms that we're using to actually look for clinical deterioration across all of our units in all of our hospitals. Obviously, the one that is most germane to what we're talking about is the EPIC sepsis prediction model. And so right at sort of basically our fingertips, right, we can see that score, do our chart review, understand, hey, what's their code status? Why are they in the hospital? Trend vital signs, and process all of that information quickly. So that has been sort of a huge win for us. And again, even though that is, I think, fancy and encouraging and a nice model, I mean, the real magic of this whole process is we're frankly just applying a checklist to what is very complex care. And again, when some of our authors in the US had sort of broken down how many tasks it takes to actually deliver bundled sepsis care, it's over 100 tasks. And that's very difficult to do if you're a bedside clinician taking home call. And so having someone actually dedicated to delivering care in this manner, we thought would lead to a lot less process variation. So again, that just sort of speaks to the logistics. And again, I mentioned that we have 12 hospitals. The hardest thing isn't actually the medicine, it's actually the logistics of having a doctor in our virtual health center be able to deliver care in all of those hospitals. And unfortunately, sort of the bureaucracy on the US to make that happen is basically why I have so much gray hair. And then, of course, again, we needed to communicate that this is the way we were going to actually deliver care. And that was a lot of hard conversations, right? There's very much this tension, and I think appropriate tension, between bedside autonomy, and those are the providers that know the patient best. But there is an advantage of combining that with a fresh set of eyes from the virtual health center who maybe is just less biased in terms of what is going on. They have less preconceived notions about whether or not sepsis may or may not actually be present. And then we needed to generate some quick wins, right? That was very important for us. So very quickly, we realized that we really were driving care upstream and that we were actually detecting sepsis actually earlier. And that goes back to that earlier slide where those delays in the recognition of sepsis were sort of backing us into a corner and not allowing us to meet our goals of delivering timely antibiotics. So we were actually detecting more sepsis, a 30% increase in sepsis by using those predictive algorithms, and we were detecting it faster. That was actually a big win for us. As I mentioned as well, BPA stand for best practice advisories. These are all of these, the interruptions to your workflow. And they were frankly incredibly exhausting and distracting for our bedside nurses. It just was a process that wasn't working and was sort of rife with alarm fatigue. So with by turning off those bedside best practice alerts and just using our process and doing calls to the bedside, we went from effectively 60 interruptions in a nursing sort of work shift to just 2 calls. And obviously that was a big win for our nurses. And so again, that's going to allow our bedside nurses, instead of having to navigate our electronic health record, it's going to allow them to do that critical work, which frankly saves patient lives. So here's some of the operational data from our program. Again, the gray columns here represent data sort of pre-virtual sepsis, and obviously the red columns are post. And this is sort of important here is that, again, we're able to actually deliver the sepsis care faster. So time to blood cultures, almost more than an hour faster, time to antibiotics, about 30 minutes faster, and time to fluids, when appropriate, is about 20 minutes faster as well. So what we've seen, again, actually, so that we divided our data into what we call leading and lagging indicators. These, this is an example of our leading indicators, our actual operational metrics. And now we're actually getting that signal in our mortality data as well. And we are seeing positive signal that we're actually moving the needle on mortality. So that's very exciting. But we're still sort of left with this issue of how do we actually balance that bedside provider autonomy with this sort of centralized model of care delivery through the virtual health center. And that's going to be a tricky course to navigate. So summary, again, virtual health has this enormous potential to transform healthcare delivery, and that has accelerated exponentially in this era of COVID. Again, as I'd say, the technology can be challenging, but it's never the hardest part. The ability to communicate and actually manage change is by far the biggest challenge in telemedicine. And then again, not all operational problems can be solved with virtual health. And so if you're thinking about, again, what sort of programs to build at your home institutions, you really do need to be strategic on what problems you want to try and solve through the virtual health lens. So hopefully that generated some questions. So why don't we start there? That is a great question, and it's been mixed, to be honest. So, I mean, taking the nursing lens, the nurses more universally have been excited about this program, and that's simply because there are just less interruptions for them and less noise in their day-to-day work. Physicians, it's been more of a mixed bag, where I think, and this is appropriate, bedside physicians feel that they know their patients best, and I think that that's actually true in much of the case. And it's threatening from someone from afar to sort of be meddling, as it can sometimes be seen from our virtual health center. So we've had to do a lot of work. And really the playbook there is very similar to telestroke programs and how they were perceived 10 or 15 years ago, in terms of sort of taking, again, sort of potentially control away from the bedside physician and putting it into a specialist. But again, the data has been important in sort of telling the story, and it becomes an easier argument if outcomes are improving to actually sustain a program like this.
I just want to say that it pays, the cost-benefit ratio seems to be very clear regarding clinical outcomes and the cost of monitoring center. So because that's a thing that is a worry for all the hospital administrator. What's your experience on that, Dr. Davis?
Yes, that's a great question, and it goes back to well, let me sort of say it this way: it's there's no way having a nurse dedicated to this and a physician dedicated to this 24/7 and only doing this, that could never be sustainable. So this sort of goes back to the earlier slide of why the physicians are actually participating in a number of programs so that we can actually have a scalable model. But the key is, again, those prescriptive algorithms where, again, one physician can monitor hundreds, if not 1,000, inpatient beds efficiently. So that's sort of the key to this in terms of, how to actually build or invest in a program that has a dedicated telemedicine command hub. There has to be that sort of enough momentum to and enough programs to justify the expense of all of that staff dedicated to virtual care. I hope that answered your question.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Davis.
Of course. Yes, yeah. So it was actually built from the information technology budget. And that's how that's where it actually still lives today. And we really do think about the virtual health center as a cost avoidance structure, right? It's not like we're asking each of our hospitals to pay for this service. We think that this does allow, this model allows for cost avoidance at the bedside care model. Again, so an example would be, it's hard to hire half of a physician or half of a nurse. And so the virtual health center allows this sort of organic load balancing and can allow for leaner staffing models without a decrease in quality at the bedside. No, not currently. Because this program is all internal to UC Health, we don't do any of any of that billing. Now, if we went external to our own hospitals, and we're starting to entertain that possibility, then we would have to come up with some sort of contractual model. But right now, again, yeah, we're not generating professional fees.
Okay. So sepsis is only one of the programs that you have. Do you extrapolate this to, for example, monitoring of, I don't know, chronic patients that may not have to go to the hospital because they are more sick?
Yes.
And instead of that, you are avoiding that, and the healthcare will be a benefit with that?
Yes, that's it. We focused, of course, on virtual sepsis today, but we're building our programs for what we call remote patient monitoring. You know, some people might call hospital at home, but it is using, again, wearable devices that a patient can wear, either sort of a sort of a wristwatch or a patch that can stream in vital signs from the patient's home. And detect that deterioration in chronic illness. And we've really made a lot of progress doing that with COVID patients. You know, again, because this has been such, COVID the clinical course was so unpredictable in these early days. We just didn't know who was going to deteriorate and who wasn't. Having the safety net was important for us. And the same sort of issues of, hey, if we can actually manage the patient from home and watch for that deterioration, then we're not using PPE, we're reducing the risk for our staff, if we can actually do all that care virtually. So that's very important to us, and in our sort of our goals and mission for the next 1 or 2 years is to figure out how to do that, not just for COVID, but for diabetes, congestive heart failure, and COPD.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I've sort of helped to manage that whole umbrella and sort of developing the infrastructure to allow all of those video visits. But I agree with you. I think COVID will go away, but I don't think we're going to go back to delivering healthcare the way we did in 2019. We're just not going back. Telehealth has really demonstrated its power and its efficiencies. It's less costly, and so we may swing back some of the way, but certainly not all of the way. And patients are going to, frankly, I think, demand it. Right? And a good example is if you had an outpatient, ambulatory, operation, but you drove several hundred miles to get that surgery done. We're going to do that follow-up visit via telehealth. Why make that patient drive another 100 or 200 miles just to do a 5-minute incision check for their operative procedure? It just doesn't make any sense. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. As we talked before, the main focus of our audience is in Latin America. Many of them, they are working in rural areas, and probably they don't have access to the sophisticated toys that I call them for doing telemedicine. But You mentioned very well in one of the slides that the technology or the budgets that you may have for these kind of activities is not the primary barrier. Yep. Probably the primary barrier is under our skull. I don't know, would you like to make some comments about your experience? And I don't know what kind of experience you have in working with Latin American countries or of third world countries in general. You've been in Greenland, where it's a very wild environment, trying to get connected with the Arctic people. But anyway, probably because of that, you may have some insights of what you can recommend people trying to develop a telehealth or telemedicine system in these countries.
And one of my passions is figuring out how to export the best quality care that just healthcare has to offer into rural places and potentially disadvantaged places that just don't have that access. And I think that's an important point, that again, we can have all the fanciest technology of the world, but in many cases, I don't think it's necessary, right? Again, being able to actually support a healthcare worker who's in a rural village or rural town, but who having a safety net to be able to talk either with that person either through a secure text or a secure email, just giving that sort of guidance, I still think can move the needle. And again, it doesn't need to be fancy bio patches that are streaming vital signs. There are ways to improvise around all of that. So that is something that I'm absolutely passionate about, is how do we actually develop those systems and those standards of care to raise the bar and improve healthcare outcomes in the whole world.
My question, Dr. Davis, is that as an oncologist, I've been trained to value the team approach to care, and it's been proven, although hard to measure, the team approach is better than single individual decision making. So in your model, who's making the decision or giving antibiotics or giving specific things to a septic patient? And can you assess the value of a team approach versus single individual approach to care?
Manuel, that is it's such a good question, and really gets at the soul of this I think of this program. So pardon the long-winded introduction or answer to the question, but in my mind, it's not enough to detect the sepsis. We really needed to have a care arc to actually deliver care from the virtual health center too, right? So the doctor at the virtual health center could order antibiotics if necessary. And an example might be that, hey, if it's a surgery patient and that surgeon is in the operating room and they simply cannot, they're not available to answer a page, then again, the virtual health center doctor can be a safety net to deliver that timely care. But the way we designed the program was, as soon as we saw signal for sepsis, our doctors in the virtual health center are paging the bedside care doctors and having that collaborative discussion. And we think of it almost as again, a sepsis, what we call timeout, where it's just like, hey, this is what we're seeing. Do you think this could be sepsis? And it's almost like, sort of a nudge, just to sort of stop and think. And many times it's, oh no, this isn't sepsis. This is a GI bleed. That's why the patient's heart rate is fast and respiratory rate is fast, et cetera. That's sepsis is not happening. But sometimes it's enough to nudge and again to say, hey, well, this is a little bit odd. Let's do a little bit more digging. And I do think that there's a lot of value to that actual collaborative approach. So I hope that answered your question. Yep.
Yes, you did. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it took probably about 6 months. And the most of that time, honestly, was not building the technical infrastructure, but actually doing all of the communication planning. How do we get to talk to all of our medical directors at all of those different hospitals and all of the different regions and all of the staff meetings. That's what took the most time. But luckily, in parallel, then we can actually, we were able to build the IT infrastructure to allow that data to flow into the virtual health center. When we first, when we first launched this, right, the first few months was all about iterating on the process. And again, what we thought this was going to look like 18 months ago is very different from what it looks like today, as we constantly try and tweak and improve the process.
The other question secondary to that one would be, what was your budget to start, to do the jump start?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's never, I've never had to actually truly calculate the cost of this because so much of this is what we would call sunk cost. The system has already decided to put that doctor there and that nurse there, and they're doing other work. So I've never been able to actually pull out, okay, of the 10 services that are offered through the virtual health center, sepsis costs X amount. So that is hard for me to answer. But there is the cost of having a nurse available 24/7 and a physician available 24/7. The technology, less so. But of course, we want to keep that physician busy and that nurse busy doing other things as well. So sorry, I don't have a more specific answer.
Would you like to speculate all the other possibilities that you can do using the same kind of a platform or kind of a system?
Yeah, yes, no, absolutely. I think you are right, Paco. It is algorithmic. There's two ways that we're going to try and build on the program. The first is, which we've started to do, is to design a similar program around respiratory distress for our COVID patients. So I think probably what everyone on this webinar has seen, those patients can get very sick very fast. And it is the same sort of model where we are watching their vital signs. That vital sign is streaming into the virtual health center so that we can see it. We have we'll call them alarms or predictive algorithms to say, hey, this patient is deteriorating, and we can detect that faster. And then the same thing, we'll notify the bedside, hey, this patient is looking much worse because their oxygen requirement is going up, their respiratory rate is going up. And if the bedside physician is maybe it's 3 a.m, they're at home and they can't get eyes on them, then we as the physician in the virtual health center will be that safety net for them. So that's just sort of one example of how we'll build on, again, as you said, sort of the template or algorithm of this program.
Yeah, Dr. Davis, as Dr. La Rosa mentioned earlier, some of us do medical missions to poor areas of the world. And we see often the same challenges of care: neutropenic patients, sepsis, what have you, pneumonia, etc. The standards that one uses in America, in part because of this desire to be medically legally protected, you do a number of the patients as pneumonia, you do CAT scan. Yeah. Well, there you don't do a CAT scan. You barely do cultures. So the question that I have is that, can you see a situation whereby a cost-effectiveness protocol can be developed to the approach of certain diseases, comparing through technology the medical outcomes of people treated with a fancy care that includes CAT scans and MRIs and cultures, etc., as opposed to just a straight clinician judgment of care for somewhat similar situations, as long as the patient meets the same protocol criteria? Do you understand my question? I hope I not confuse you.
No, I think I do understand it. Yes, well, I mean, to be frank, I don't, all of the fancy, well, how would I say this, right? I think the data is there. We have all of the fancy MRIs and all the fancy tests, but healthcare outcomes in the United States are by far not the best in the world, right? And so that in and of itself is evidence that there is a cheaper, more efficient way to deliver to deliver care. I do want to speak though that and I mean this broadly, that's again, physician bias is very real. And so, but I do think it is, I think to your point, it is possible to actually develop tools that a physician in an austere environment could use to sort of test their logic and test their thinking. And that would be, right? I mean, we're never going to have 10,000 MRI machines in Africa, or 1,000 more CAT scans in Latin America. I mean, there isn't. I just don't think the resources are there to build that, and frankly, I don't think it's the right course either. So, all right, again, that was a rambling answer, but hopefully I got to your question. But let me try and summarize it again. I think that's where the power of AI, or artificial intelligence decision support, that is tailored to resource limited environments, is going to be so powerful. So.
Thank you.
Well, I think that we have squeezed your experience in your brain a little bit, and thank you so much for your kind acceptance for giving this international presentation. I think that is very valuable for anyone who wants to learn a little bit more about telehealth and telemedicine. Our association, as I mentioned before, is open to all professions as long as you are involved in some way with telemedicine. Either you are a physician or a nurse or a technician or any educator who is involved in this kind of practice, you are welcome to join us. Just go to our website, teleiberoamerican.com, teleiberoamerica.com. You can join us and keep in touch with all these presentations and all this updating that we are trying to do. Our mission, as I mentioned before, is basically academic. We have our sponsor, AMD Global Telemedicine, that we appreciate their sponsorship. They have the toys, and I always say that without those toys, sometimes it's difficult to work with some things. But just this media, just using Zoom, I think that it has been a revolution in this time of crisis. In any way, family relationships, education, research, medical practice, etc., is being taken care of. I can share with you my screen at any moment, and whatever I'm seeing under the microscope, instead of have a pathologist at the other side, I can share with any part of the world these images. So I encourage you not to be intimidated by the technology or the budgets or things like that. We always can find a way to do it if we have the right approach, the positive mind. And thank you so much, Davis. You've been an example, and we want to have you again. So I wanted to commit you again to give another presentation. You will. Thank you so much.
Thank you for all the questions, and very nice to meet you all via Zoom. Please be safe, and hopefully we'll be in touch.
Thank you. God bless you. Bye-bye.